Caleb is a coalition of churches, nonprofits, labor unions, civic organizations that come together around common issues in order to build power for change. I mean, that's really the short of it.
Especially in action. I think, faith without works is dead. And then equality of seeing that everyone has a seat at the table. And then also love. Without love, we won't be able to do anything, or nothing will be fruitful of what we do. And then benevolence is the kindness. Just showing kindness in a mean world, I think speaks volume, as well as there are so many people that have it in their heart that they want to do something, but don't know how to do it, or where to do it, or how to get involved. And so right now, what Caleb is at the right moment is because we're just a reflection of allowing people to see that it can no longer happen on our watch. I think that the time of change is always now. There's never a period where we can wait for justice to come. We're going to have to make it come. I think that the time is right now because we have so many committed and dedicated people that have sacrificed their time to say, I want to be involved. Not just speak of what they want to do, but actually put their heart and their soul and their monies behind it. And I think that's what has helped us. When you have dedicated people, when you have committed people, when you have people that have found their passion, that's what has made the difference. We have been able to connect people that have found their passion. They have found their voice, and they are using it.
Good evening, fellow Chattanoogan's. Good evening, Mr. Wade Hinton. Thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Joe Payton, and on behalf of the Caleb Tax Incentive Accountability and Transparency Campaign, tonight we're going to have Wade Hinton for our final mayoral candidate on 7 p.m. Friday night, which is great. So thank you all. Right now we have some important issues we want to discuss with candidate Hinton concerning economic mobility in Chattanooga as we recover from a pandemic, and also seek to expand economic opportunity and security in an increasingly competitive and interconnected global economic environment. We are grateful that you are sharing an hour of your time with us this Friday night to explore this important government responsibility. During the program, we invite people in the audience to submit questions that pertain to the topic of economic mobility, accountability, and transparency. And if you can please post them in the chat, we will do our best to include them as time allows during the question and answer with candidate Hinton. Also, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat, and our Caleb members will help you with those as well. So now we'd like to welcome again candidate Hinton, and we'll move into the introduction. So before we get into a brief video presentation, Mr. Hinton, would you mind going ahead and introducing yourself and a little bit about your vision and plans for Chattanooga's economic future?
Sure, Joe. First of all, thank you so much for hosting me and being with me on a Friday night. I know it may be date night, and this is the social hour for a lot of folks. So thank you for being with us and taking time out. I know you've been through a number of these conversations, and I just want to thank Caleb for first organizing this, right? I mean, again, it's important that we have these conversations about our economic future and how we get more Chattanoogans to participate in all the progress that we're seeing. But it's also important, I mean, it's also just great that you're lifting up these issues in general, right? I mean, I know that you're dealing with economic mobility, also community land trust, the work you're doing around that. So just thank you for doing this. This is what it should look like when you talk about engagement. And just know through a Hinton administration, this is what it's going to feel like. We're going to make sure we're engaging with you along the way. It's also great to see familiar faces around the Zoom, by the way. So good evening to y'all. So listen, I'll just give a little bit of my background. I'm a native of Chattanooga, born and raised in a community called the West Side. Grew up with service being one of those values my mom taught me, just stuck with me. And I left for school. I went off to college at Emory in Atlanta, then Memphis for law school. But I felt called back. I felt like I needed to come back because the Chattanooga that I saw as an adult, as a lawyer, was quite different from the one I experienced growing up in the West Side. And the one there, I certainly felt a sense of community in my neighborhood, but I didn't feel that same sense of belonging from the broader city. And I wanted to come back and really began to work on issues like diversity and inclusion and all of those, and equity, to figure how do we begin to make sure that more voices are around the table. So much of my career, although I've been practicing law for 20 years in the private sector and public sector, served as city attorney, sort of lead counsel for Volkswagen, but a lot of my work has been around equity and inclusion. And so what you'll see from me, or what you've seen from me, or things like when I didn't believe that there were enough voices around the table that reflected the diversity of our community, I created Board Connector, which has now placed dozens of folks who ordinarily would not have been tapped to serve, talented, but hadn't been asked to serve on nonprofit boards, now serving and being able to have more voice around the table. You saw me do things like RestoreMyRights.com, which was really out of me going door to door, knocking on doors, asking folks to register to vote, saying, I can't register because I have a felony. Well, how do you know? So let's take them through that decision-making process and help them understand what their rights are. Or being a founding member of Sankofa, or the charter president for the Urban League Young Professionals. But so throughout my 20 years here, time and time again, you've seen me out front working on issues around equity. And so my administration is going to be one that's completely rooted in equity and inclusion, accountability and transparency, and also collaboration. I'll tell you, when we talk about our vision, my first priority, though you mentioned this pandemic is unprecedented, is going to be focusing on helping us get through this, but having an equitable recovery. We know that there were disparities before this pandemic. They were deepened by what happened. And now we have a chance to reimagine what this should look like on the other side, and making sure we're touching more folks. We also want to make sure we have an inclusive economy, and I'll touch on that later. But really, again, we say this is the best town ever, but it's not for everyone. So how do we begin to make sure we pour into folks through investing in communities, investing in talent throughout our city, and make sure that more people are able to participate in this growth and process and progress. And we'll, again, talk about some of these things around early learning, partnering with Hamilton County Schools. But for me, again, a lot of this work is all about us being a more inclusive city. A city that when my daughter, who's 5 now, when she gets older and she has to make decisions about what she's going to do, and other kids have to make those decisions, they're going to know not just their neighborhood embraces them or has a sense of belonging, but the entire city believes in them and invests in them. And we're going to start that work. We're going to start that work in April.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. And we will now have a brief presentation of Caleb. Maybe familiar for some, but we like to just make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. So we'll do that real quick. Thank you.
This is the Caleb Coalition's Economic Mobility Task Force Candidate Forum in a series that's going to go on for the next 2 weeks. And we're going to do a very shortened presentation of our Develop With Us campaign. It's a campaign that our task force launched just a few months ago, focused on accountability and transparency in city government.
A little over a year ago, our process started with wanting to understand how to involve the community and how we as an organization to play a positive role for better economic prospects and better economic inclusion in our city. And the Develop With Us campaign is our special focus that we will be continuing into the next administration to try to ensure that the public interest is served through the economic development strategy and use of public resources.
So as we kind of dove into this, there's a lot to be said about the state of our economy. Economic growth has been great for some, but we know that the majority of Chattanoogan's are still struggling to make ends meet. And so as we began to talk to our members and talk to our neighbors and do outreach in the community, some of the things that consistently kept coming up and what we were hearing was that people were feeling left out of the big decisions that impact their lives. There's a lack of clarity about how decisions are made. We see development happening in our communities, but folks are wondering and not quite sure how that development was happening and really concerned that their voice wasn't being heard in the process of development.
Our values or what good development looks like are living wages. No one should have to work more than one full-time job to provide for themselves or their family. Community stability. Investment should increase opportunity and quality of life for low and moderate income families. Every Chattanoogan deserves secure housing in a safe and thriving community. Our third value is equitable transit. When people have access to safe, affordable public transit, they're able to get to jobs, training, and education that provide pathways to economic sustainability.
And so what do we want? We want transparency and accountability. We want transparency and a community voice in decisions involving public money that will impact our neighborhoods. And we want accountability, community-centered metrics that ensure that companies who get public resources are actually benefiting our people. And what we want, good development. Good development happens with us and not to us.
The real focus of our Development With Us campaign is on one factor that guides economic development here locally, and that is the tax breaks and incentives deals that are given as part of our recruitment of employers.
And every year, there are companies that receive tax breaks from our city. They're receiving public incentives to build their buildings and do business. And so we had some questions. What's the real magnitude of tax breaks in terms of real dollars? How do tax breaks work? Who decides which companies receive a tax break? How do we make sure that these decisions actually improve our health, wages, financial security, and life circumstances? And most importantly, where do you and I fit into that? So just last year, the amount of corporate property taxes that were forgiven or written off by the city of Chattanooga and Hamilton County totaled over $25 million. And typically these tax agreements last between 10 and 30 years.
That tax revenue, if it were collected, would be part of funding our local infrastructure, public safety, parks, libraries, neighborhood services. And when those essential public services come under strain, or when there is a lack of tax revenue, this is part of the reason why.
Not that tax incentive deals are necessarily bad. In fact, sometimes they're very needed, but we have questions about them. So it turns out with that $25 million that was given out in tax breaks last year, over 90% of these were given through a type of tax breaks called the Jobs Pilot. And typically these are used to help attract new development and new companies to the city.
A pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. It's basically an agreement between the city and a company that provides the company with a tax break for getting here. So it's an incentivization deal to get businesses to develop here. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. They create, because we want development here, we want jobs here. But before we, start handing out jobs pilots, willy-nilly, we want to ask a few questions.
Do these tax breaks actually create real benefit for our communities? Is it worth what we would lose in property tax revenue? And would the company locate here anyway? Do they even need the incentive in the first place?
So I just want to talk a little bit about the current process for that and lay it out in a little comic. First, the city hires the Chamber of Commerce to recruit businesses to Chattanooga. From there, businesses will complete a jobs pilot application, and then the Chamber of Commerce reviews that application. So what about the public? Well, unfortunately, there are no publicly adopted criteria for jobs pilots and how those get put forward. And so there are no required public hearings and no staff report at this point. So very little public involvement. Next, the City's Industrial Development Board, also known as the IDB, conducts a final review of the pilot application. The IDB takes ownership of the land, equipment, buildings of the company, and then the company leases the assets from the IDB for a small amount. And so the big question we're asking here tonight, are these agreements benefiting our communities?
You've heard the expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I don't know, how much this map is worth. Basically, we won't go into the detail on it, but what it shows, anything you see in a color is tax advantaged, which is to say it doesn't pay property taxes the way you and I do. So in it, we're showing pilots, we're showing tax increment financing, and we're also showing government-owned properties, which are tax exempt. And I think what this map tells us is that we've got a lot of properties in the city of Chattanooga that are colored. And so they're not saying they're not paying their fair share. There's some good reasons why some of them are not. But you can see when you take those properties out of the mix that the burden falls to the rest of us, to small businesses, to homeowners and all like that. So also given the fact that, as we said earlier, that this represents about $25 million just in tax incentives, we need to be really careful before we add more color to this map. As we've said earlier, we're not against all tax incentives, but we believe we need to be strategic. We need to make sure that any incentive, and we're talking specifically here about jobs pilots, that there is significant public benefit in terms of the number of jobs, the investment, but also the wages of these jobs. And also we need to make sure that the but-for test is met. The but-for test means without the incentive, we wouldn't be here. We feel like that some of the pilots that we've given in the past, the company likely would have located regardless. It was more the sort of the icing on the cake, and the cake was already baked. So we need to be really careful. We need to be strategic, we believe, in the future.
The process for actually arranging these pilots is extremely opaque, and it takes place between the mayor, the chamber, and the business in question, with very little opportunity even for city council people to become educated about the project that they're about to give away many years of future taxes for. So we're asking for a transparent process and a plan with a concrete cost-benefit analysis and a public forum where citizen and council input can have a little bit more time to mature and be brought forward. The second major barrier is that currently, because of the very short window for actually educating ourselves about it, there's pretty much a rubber stamp that gets put on all of these pilots once they've come out of the chamber. Even the IDB board rarely has any dissenting votes or even any questions about these pilots. And that, for both the IDB and the city council, that can be chalked up to the immense amount of political pressure that there is to get these things done once they're already presented on a silver platter by the mayor and chamber. Finally, we've been suffering from a narrow vision of our economic planning that doesn't look at long-term impacts, doesn't meet long-term goals, while still locking us into these long-term agreements. So we are hoping that elected candidates will put forward a comprehensive plan that fits these pilots into a plan to get Chattanooga's wages up to where they match the real estate market, where they match the growth in living expenses. And if we can put it into a long-term plan, then it's easier to understand why we're making this or that pilot, and the whole process becomes something that the whole city can get behind, rather than just the people whom it directly benefits.
But with that, we're going to get into some specific questions.
All right, great. Some interesting points of discussion there. I'd like to just take a quick moment and clarify a couple of things from the video, because it was a condensed video. It didn't go into some of these things. And that is the economic statistics that were given in the video. Those are statistics which come from the U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And those were the most recent statistics for 2019. So those are pre-pandemic numbers. And so what they were was 9% for the decade from 2009 to 2019, we had 9% less GDP total growth here in Chattanooga than the national average. We had 17% less median income on average compared to the U.S. average. We had 13% family poverty. That was as of 2019. We had 20% less median wage growth. So our growth is 20% less for Chattanoogans, and that's a direct comparison to the U.S. average. So we know that these are structural deficits and that they're with us prior to the pandemic, and they've only gotten worse. So we have a few questions now, and you have about 3 minutes for each question unless we say otherwise. So we'll start with the first one, who will be presented by Ms. Janice Gooden.
Yes, Mr. Hinton, the first question, as we've researched and talked to a variety of stakeholders about our current processes for granting tax incentives, we were surprised by the lack of information provided to both the public and key decision makers. Were there specific items in our Develop With Us presentation that you were surprised to learn? How will you gather, assess, and incorporate public input into the city plans, policies, and development projects in your administration?
So thank you, Janice, for that question. And again, thank you for that video. That was really well done. I want to say that when you ask about whether many surprises, so most of you know I served as a city attorney for about 5 years. And Helen, I just want you to know that when I was watching this, all that was going through my mind was "but for." I just heard your voice saying "but for" in the background, right? So I just want to keep saying. And so not a lot of surprises because I'm very familiar with the pilot process. While I was at the city, had a chance to engage with a number of folks here on this. And so I know, again, how this works. And also that means I know how we can make it better. I know how we can improve. And I think about making sure we have a really clear set of criteria and sort of how do we assess and begin to prioritize living wages and making sure we have a public ROI. Getting that information out there to the public is really important. And so I've looked at, again, I know what our process looks like, but I've also seen some examples that really clearly provide some true transparency on this. So Memphis Edge is one example of that. That's one aspect of this. The other side of this is how do we create the opportunity for public input? Know that we'll have an Office of Equity and Engagement. Part of that is to make sure we're bringing more folks around the table to hear their voice. But the easiest way is to make sure that the process itself and the policy and procedures call for that. Helen will know that when we did the TIP policy, we created a couple of steps along the way to allow for more hearings. And I think that's something that we certainly can identify in the pilot process. And then the other piece is, we want to make sure that we're transparent in how these particular pilots are performing. So we want to share the results. We should make it easier for you to look at a database Again, Memphis is a great example. You can just go on and look at for every project, how things are moving. And then lastly, we got to make sure we're holding businesses accountable. It's not enough to incentivize. It's not enough to make sure that we're getting jobs here and good paying jobs in how we'll do this. But we got to hold them accountable. And I'll tell you, Helen knows this. I was helped get $6 million back from Alstom when it didn't meet all of its obligations. And although that clawback language was written in such a way, we certainly have increased it or improved it. And I think we can certainly do more to help with this. But we got to hold businesses accountable as well in terms of meeting those obligations, not only for workers and all those other things, but any other obligations that are under our pilots or MOUs.
Thank you.
Great. And just to follow up on that question, or maybe she asked it, but some concrete examples of what a public input process looks like to you. I mean, how do we make sure that the public input process is meaningful, that it elicits good information, that it really gets it from a broad spectrum, and that it really is incorporated in a good fashion?
Yeah, thanks for that follow-up. So, I mean, listen, one of the things I'm most proud of as city attorney is I would have citizens around the table. I would have their input, and it would show up in policy. I think Helen would tell you when we did the housing pilot policy or the TIF policy, there were some suggestions, and we tried to make sure we incorporated some of those. Not everything, but we tried to incorporate some of those ideas into our policies. And so I just want to make sure that when we talk about input, it's always going to be meaningful to me, right? There are two opportunities to make sure that we're getting input in from citizens. One is I can see during the IDB process, we could certainly create a hearing then, or we could do one at council. I think that is certainly, again, one place we could create that, where, again, you create, you provide the notice that's needed, and we invite folks into the meetings, and they have an opportunity to voice their opinion. And so those are a couple of ways that come to mind for me that I think we could do. And again, it's about putting it in the system. The one thing that I'll tell you, and why I'm running, is I know culturally we've got to do some things differently, but systemically we've got to do some things differently. And I know how policies work, I know how legislation works, and I know where we can make those improvements to make sure that we have more voices around the table. And so just know the policies will actually embed that, whether again it's at IDB or City Council, and create an actual time frame for people to participate and have their voices heard.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so moving to our second question will be from Ms. Helen Burns-Sharp.
Hi, Wade. It's good to see you. It's been a long time.
I know.
So I've got a sort of a general question and then a more specific follow-up question. The general question is, if elected mayor, are there specific individuals or groups that you would expect to rely on for economic development planning and decision-making?
Yeah, so great question, Helen. Again, good to see you. So absolutely, I mean, there are, some, first I would look to some people in our administration, right? We want to make sure we have, I've thought about adding an analyst to our economic and community development team to help us really begin to vet how we analyze and assess pilots and the implications, and be able to present that in a more a cohesive manner, right? So people have a coherent manner, so people have that in front of them. But I'm also going to make sure that we have IDB and HEB members that can certainly come in with some level of expertise or information that they could share with us as well. But more than likely, a lot of the things I'd also be looking at is also our local, regional, and national partners. In creating this framework, we certainly have the chamber and folks at UTC, UTK that can be helpful, and ATM who can be helpful in us thinking about how this looks. But we also think about other communities that have been there before that can show us best practices, but also we can identify these leading practices as well. Beyond that, groups like the National League of Cities and other, whether it's Harvard or Brookings, that we can look to again to help us inform what that looks like. But I'm going to rely heavily on, again, some folks here locally to give us some guidance on what works well for Chattanooga. Again, I've been there. I know how to have folks around the table, and that's something that I want to make sure we're doing. The other side of this is whatever framework we come up with, it has to fit into our longer term economic development plan. That's something that you all mentioned during the video. And we've got to have a long-term plan. Short-term, yes, we've got to get through COVID. I mean, this is priority number one for me. We got to get through COVID in a way that's equitable, but we also have to think about long-term what that looks like. That's me sitting down with the community stakeholders and other partners to make sure we're thinking about where should we make those investments, whether it's talent or whether it's infrastructure, what do we do to really move the needle? And I think that also is going to help us think about who we listen to and who we get information from.
Okay, thank you. So here's the follow-up question. I'll give you an example near and dear to your heart, the West Side. Yeah. As you know, there is a lot of development interest in the area along Riverfront Parkway, the former Alston site in particular. So we're blessed in Chattanooga, I think, that we have a very strong private sector, and we've got entrepreneurs and people with ideas and willing to make investments. On the other hand, my perception has been that we don't always, from the public sector, have the people at the table questioning things, trying to tighten things, particularly when it comes to incentives. Yeah. So my question would be, just in the next 4 years of a new administration, we may get requests for a TIF or public funding of a baseball stadium or pilots or whatever. Not saying that those necessarily would be bad, but going back to the map with all that color on it and looking at all the needs we have in Chattanooga, where we need property tax dollars. So the question would be, what would you do to make sure the public interest is protected and to make sure that the people that normally aren't at the table, that their interests are being protected? Example, as you're well aware, gentrification in the downtown area and the South Side over the years. So as we develop these areas, what do you have any suggestions as to how the people who are there now, such as in Cottage Hill Courts, how they might be protected and how we might provide for mixed income or affordable housing in that area?
Yeah, Helen, you're right. That is near and dear to my heart. My mom is in a Ridgeway right there in the West Side, and that's something that I'm thinking about, right? And so let me start with this sense of making sure that folks are at the table, right? Again, I came back to make sure there are more folks and more voices at the table. So whenever I'm doing work, whenever the work I do, I'm trying to advocate to ensure that we have more diversity, more inclusion, and more equity in how some of these things are being decided. Again, that's why I've Board Connector and some other things that I've created. One thing I'm also proud of is that when there was some conversation about the West Side, I spoke with Eric Myers at the design studio. I said, look, if you're going to do this, you've got to make sure that you have the residents at the table. We can't have a repeat of Harriet Tubman. We cannot have that at all. And so I know that there's been more engagement. I know that there's been more communication and people at the table talking about this, but we've got to build it in to get to your question. We've got to build it into the process. That's the easiest way, because it's too ad hoc if you do it any other way, right? And when you do it that way, it's also really transparent and clear to the public about what's expected and to developers about what's expected. So that's how I think we would address that, Helen, to make sure that it's really clear in the framework. So there isn't a, are we going to do this or are we not kind of deal. We've got to make sure that it's out there for people to see us and then hold us accountable, which I know you will. I know you will.
Okay. Thank you, Wade.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Helen. And let's see, we have another question now from Ms. Gooden once again.
The next question I have is the 2019 disparity report revealed that significant disparities were identified between the proportion of City of Chattanooga procurement contracts that were allocated to white male-owned and operated entities as opposed to minority or women-owned business entities. Minority business entities in particular were grossly denied. How will you provide leadership to address this critical weakness in the city's procurement and contractor development programs? What steps will you take to encourage improvement in the larger relationship networks and activities of the business community?
Thanks, Janice. So, I have also worked on these issues around minority business programs and enterprise programs for a good part of my career. When I was at the county, I implemented the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise program and sat on the DBE task force for the state. Even while I was at Unum as the Chief Diversity Officer, we revised and updated our policy there, while at the city, worked with James McKissick on policies around enhancing our program, and actually shepherded the RFP process for the firm that was actually chosen to conduct the disparity study. So for me, it gave me great joy and pride that we got the disparity study done, because legally, I knew there were some things we could not do in terms of setting goals without that disparity study. So one of the first things you'll see me do is to make sure we're implementing the recommendations that are coming out of it. And that to me is going to be key. And that it will be owned by our procurement piece, right? What we have seen at some points are, you may have an office of multicultural affairs or some other office that may handle or do. We're going to create an office of equity and engagement that would actually make sure that our procurement office is responsible for having inclusive and equitable practices. So it is their role and their responsibility to ensure that we're meeting the obligations under that disparity study. More than that, I have done this in the past, and I will do it again as mayor, which is I'm going to pull private sector partners around the table. And because I know as a city, we're going to model it for sure. We're going to make sure that we're being intentional and again, meeting the obligations of the disparity study and recommendations. But it's going to be important that we have Unum and Blue Cross and EPB and others around the table to make commitments as well. And I'm going to ask them, as mayor, to do this. We have to really begin to move the needle. The city can do this as a government, but I know that collectively, we're going to make even more impact. So that is something I've done in the past on other topics and other issues, and we will do it again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. All right, and I guess I'll take another quick question here, and then we have maybe a couple of audience questions potentially in the Q&A. So, so in light of the structural economic deficits and global environment right now, especially with what COVID has kind of rearranged and realigned a lot of things, do you think the city is making sufficient investments to have the resources and the services and the environment necessary to be successful and to be secure looking forward?
Well, listen, we've got to make more investments, and I'll just share this. When I was at Volkswagen, I've shared this with a few folks. When I was at Volkswagen, I started when we were 200 employees. I left when we were 2,500. We worked a little bit. Amazon was out there, thousands of employees. Joe, there was not a bus stop. Carter didn't come out there, right? And so that's all this investment that we've made. to bring this company with all of these employees, two companies really, right? But not really being able to connect Chattanoogans with opportunities to get out there unless you had a vehicle. So how we make these investments, we have to make more, but we have to do it in a way that's more equitable. All right, if we're talking about economic mobility, we physically have to make sure that people are able to get there and have more access. It's also important for us to invest in people, right? And how we think about our overall talent strategy, right? We don't really have one. We have great initiatives that are happening right now. We have Future Ready Institutes, Chattanooga 2.0. We have Chat State's doing fantastic work. Blue Cross is doing some things, but nothing comprehensive. So we've got to think about how do we really think about that cradle to career approach. And when you do that and being intentional about it, you can then think about how do we use our community centers, our YFD centers, as places for training. You can be intentional about saying this particular zip code, we want 100 credentials coming out of this zip code in the next 2 years. When you have a true talent strategy. And for us, I also think that when we think about funding, we have to think about it also creatively. When I was at the city and we were doing the Volkswagen expansion, I added a provision, negotiated a provision in our pilots called economic development lease payments. This is the first time it had been done. And these lease payments are now being used, and they're in every pilot now, by the way. They're now being used to help support and fund these small business incentive grants and helping our small businesses that are hurting during this pandemic, right? And so we can think about other creative ways of getting funding. I do think there'll be opportunities to look at whether it's impact fees. I think we have to look at some things that may be coming down the pipe from the federal government as well, especially in wake of COVID. And also go back to the state when we talk about some of this support and work, right? Because right now, as I see it, as I remember, a lot of the work, a lot of the incentives, a lot of the support is coming from manufacturing specific kind of work, right, and jobs. And what we've got to do is try to expand that scope to allow for more, whether it's tech, logistics, other hot sectors here, to allow for investments and support that way as well. So sort of a multi-pronged approach, but again, it gets back to investing in the people.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We may have a couple of audience questions. Let me just check here. If not, I've got another couple.
I've got some queued up, Joe.
Great, great.
So we have one from Fred, and so it looks like we do just have a few minutes left. We may go just a few minutes over, and we apologize, but we do want to get to at least a couple of these questions.
I thought I had 2 hours, Austin.
That's right. Yeah, two hours, not 45 minutes. So the first one is from Fred. So it says, Mr. Hinton, are you aware of the Community Benefits Agreement initiative that was community driven regarding the Nippon Paint and Harriet Tubman site? Having been a participant throughout the process, I witnessed a severe breakdown in the process and the hearing of voices of community members. Yeah. What would you do to assure that voices of the communities are taken into account and prioritized when factory and businesses enter into our neighborhoods?
Thanks, Austin. And so I'm a little familiar with that this was happening. I was not at the city at the time, so but I've talked to a couple of folks that were involved in the process. And so what I would say is this: it goes back to Helen's question, right? It's all about how you set up the process and in the framework in which you do it, right? Again, if you're rooted in equity, that means you're engaging folks. And if you have an actual step in the process that allows for engagement from the residents and neighborhoods, then you're good. But we've got to make sure that we're putting that out there and it's very clear that people will have their voices heard. Now, I mean, here's the other piece, right? You're going to have some neighbors thinking one way and some neighbors thinking another way, right? But what we want to know is, what we want to make sure we do, though, is the process is going to be fair, it's going to be transparent, and people will have their voices heard throughout this process, and that's how we'll build it out. And again, I look forward to working with you all to help us think about what are those added steps that may be needed. And then the other side of this is, are there other ways of gathering information? Again, thinking equitably, not everybody can make it to a meeting at 6 o'clock. Are there some ways we can get communications in from folks to solicit suggestions or thoughts or their ideas, right? So we can help think about that. But that's what we would do, Fred.
Great. And then we have another question from Teal that she submitted online.
Not Teal.
Says, you have shared that neighborhood investment is important to your platform. City of Chattanooga is missing a lot of tools to prevent displacement and make sure we're creating equitable communities from the bottom up. What is your knowledge or interest in supporting a neighborhood-based CDC, Community Development Corporation, or what other community development tools do you think are missing from the current toolbox?
Well, hey, Till, thank you for joining. Good to see you. She is doing some fantastic work, by the way. So let me say this, that for too long, I mean, and listen, I grew up in a neighborhood that if you had to design something that people don't see and don't know about, that is one where interstate's going right through it. And so we know that there are neighborhoods that have felt left out, not a part of the process. And so as we're thinking about how do we sort of address this going forward, a couple of things. One, we have to think about an overall housing strategy, right? I just released a housing plan. So we have to think about a comprehensive strategy of how we will begin to look at our neighborhoods and how we begin to invest in housing, and especially affordable housing. And with that helps us to identify what tools we have and what tools we actually need. Some of the tools we have are things like the Land Bank Authority. That's one way that we could use it. Now, you're going to hear candidates talk about that. I'll tell you, when I was the city attorney, I actually drafted the legislation with my team and went up to Nashville to lobby for that to happen, not just for Chattanooga, but it happened now in Nashville and Memphis and other places that have land bank authorities. But we did that. So that's one way that we can use. But I know you're doing work around community land trusts. That could be certainly an option. And listen, I also remember coming back and there was the West Side CDC with Daphne and that team. So there are many tools that I think we could look at, but I think the strategy is going to help us identify what's really needed depending on where we want to go. The other thing I want to make sure we bring up is sometimes, we've also got to get good information out there, right? Because one of the things I also hear and we know happens is, Helen mentioned gentrification. You may have a person who has a home in a neighborhood that is close and folks are saying that's going to be the next hot place. Developer comes in, an investor comes in and offers someone $40,000 for it, knowing that they can invest $20,000 and flip it for 120, right? And so we've got to make sure that we're providing information or having at least a place where people can access to get information about what's the real value of their homes. And with a little investment, a little equity, maybe they could actually realize that true investment or that true profit or value of their homes. And so we've got to make sure we're providing that information as well. But again, that strategy will help inform a lot of those things we do.
Awesome. Well, I do want to honor our time commitment, and so I am going to turn it back to Joe for our closing portion.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hinton. And let's see, we wanted to just quickly reiterate some of our values here. Caleb is interested to show what good development looks like. And so that looks like living wages where no one has to work more than one full-time job to provide for themselves or their family. That's where we'd like to be. Community stability. Investment should increase opportunity and quality of life for low and moderate income families. And every Chattanoogan deserves secure housing and a safe, thriving community. Our other value is equitable transit. When people have access to safe, affordable public transit, they're able to get to the jobs, training, and education that provide pathways to economic sustainability. And then with regard to transparency, we'd like to see community voices in decisions involving public money. This is public money that will impact our communities and neighborhoods. And we want to see accountability. We want to see community-centered metrics that show clearly how companies who get public resources are actually going to benefit the public in the communities they live with. So good development happens with us and not to us. And now we'd like to present our 4 asks for candidate Hinton. So our first ask is, will you commit to develop and implement clear, enforceable, publicly accessible criteria for jobs pilots?
Yes.
Great. Will you help ensure that city council, relevant boards, and the general public have thorough written information outlining exactly how a proposed tax break will benefit the public? Will you ensure that this information is provided well in advance of any vote on a pilot, TIF, or other form of public incentive?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Ask number 3, will you support an effort to require relevant boards such as City Council, IDB, and HEB to hold public hearings for your respective pilot proposals?
Yes. Yes. I was going to say, yeah, yes, but yes.
All right, great.
Yeah.
All right, and our last one is, will you work with Caleb to identify and set clear expectations for appointees to the IDB and HEB boards?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, well, at this time, we'd like to thank you, Mr. Hinton, for joining us. On behalf of the Economic Community Mobility Team, we appreciate the attention and participation of all in the audience tonight in this final forum for mayor. Recordings of the event will be posted, and previous candidate forums are on the Caleb Facebook page. And so we encourage you to share those with others who are considering their vote for mayor. If you would like to see economic transparency and accountability in Chattanooga, we'd also like to invite everyone in the public to join our campaign and help us by signing up on the Caleb website, and should be posted here in the chat room. And please join us this coming Sunday evening and into next week. We're going to have additional forums for all the city council candidates coming up in the evening next week. So at this time, we'd like to present Mayor Hinton with 3 minutes to kind of make a closing statement, and that'll help wrap us up.
Hey, look, Joe, again, thank you for doing this, and thanks to Caleb for organizing this. These are, again, a great opportunity for folks to get engaged in this important information and important topic. And listen, I know we spent a lot of time talking about some of the larger employers here, but know that we are also going to be focused in helping our small businesses. We know that they're the backbone of our economy. And so we're going to be looking at how do we make sure we're supporting and providing resources to support our small businesses as well in our neighborhoods, so that they can continue to create good paying jobs. I've shared a couple of things that in terms of my background, this is the work that I have done. This work around equity and inclusion and bringing more folks to the table. This work around making sure we're focused on developing talent. So for me, this campaign is not anything new, but it is a continuation of the service that I've already been doing, the work that I've been doing for quite some time. And if you believe that Chattanooga can be a place where no matter where you live, you should have an opportunity to succeed. If you want to have access to opportunity, no matter, again, your circumstances, then I'm the person that you should vote for. Because I know that journey. I grew up in the West Side. I'm the first in my family to graduate from college and to go on to school. And I also know that my journey has been the exception and not the expectation. And we've got to make sure that this is the rule, this is the standard for every child growing up. Again, I want my daughter and other kids, when they get to to that age of 18 or wherever it is, decide they can go off to school. If they decide to come back, they need to know that Chattanooga is their home, that they have a sense of belonging, that they can succeed here. And that means that we're making the investments now, not only economically, but also culturally. When they go downtown, it feels like they're downtown, not just a downtown for tourists, but for all Chattanoogans. And that's the work we're going to do. That work starts in April, and I'm excited to have, again, this conversation. I'm going to be excited to ask you all for your vote as well. Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, I'm just going to, for more information, go to wadehinton.com.
All right, we'll let you get that in there too. All right. Well, our sincere thanks, Mr. Hinton, for your time this evening. And remember, good development happens with us, not to us. And that concludes our program. And we wish everybody in Chattanooga a safe night and a great weekend. And we'll see you soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.